vide encore devant. Je vous encourage à le faire, surtout ceux qui sont à l'arrière, sauf si vous devez partir plus tôt. If you're sitting in the back, unless you have to leave a little bit early, do come a little bit forward to the front. We have a few empty rows here. People who are just coming in, please feel free to come in. So, good afternoon to all of you. I am speaking in English because that's what our guest will be doing today. I have the great honor and pleasure of welcoming Line Vaaben with us here this afternoon. She's a journalist and an author. She is currently existential editor at Politiken, and that in itself begs for a little bit more detail. She specializes, just to kind of give you a little teaser, in narrative journalism and stories about what it means to be human. We will certainly hear a little bit more about that as Lena speaks. I just want to highlight she's also an author of several books, including about femicide, so far only in Danish, but if you do read Danish, that would be a recommended reading for you. And today, together, we're going to dive into what makes up the European art of storytelling. I'm very honored and happy to welcome you with us, and the floor is yours, Lena.
Thank you. Thank you. In 1998, I was 25 years old and studying to become a journalist. As part of my education, I had an internship at the Danish daily Berlingske, and on the second day in the newsroom, I was sent out on my first assignment. I had to cover a leak from a supertanker, which had caused a huge pool of oil to wash up on the coast in a small provincial town northwest of Copenhagen. My assignment was to go there with a photographer, gather enough material to write a story about the leak, write back and type out the story before deadline. This was by no means a big story, and my contribution was showing the consequences of the leak. Upon arrival, we parked the car at the beach and jumped out to take a look. The first thing that hit me was the smell, a harsh stench of gasoline. The next thing I saw was the birds, seagulls, covered in oil, turning and twisting in the sand. They weren't dead, but they weren't alive either. They were captured in a black, sticky cloak of death, opening their mouths, letting out sounds of pain. Now, I don't speak seagullish, but I felt they were mourning, saying, "What happened? Why?" It has been 28 years since that day, and when I close my eyes, I can still smell the oil and see the birds. I spent an hour at the site, went back, wrote my story as quickly as my inexperienced and nervous fingers could hit the keyboard, and handed it in. Afterwards, I got a nod from the editor saying, "Good work, Vaaben. I was there on the coast with you." The story didn't change the world, but it changed me. "I was there with you," he said. Now, after this experience, I became obsessed with going into the world, absorbing sensory details, writing stories to put the reader there, and to make them feel something. Since then, I have continuously used journalism, our shared profession, to gain access to people's lives, their hearts, their minds and stories, especially in places of intense suffering. I've interviewed a woman whose father killed her mother when she was 4 years old. He chopped her mother up, put her into a suitcase and dumped her in a river, while his daughter, the girl, was asleep in the room next door. She visited him in jail once every month during her childhood. I have followed a man planning his suicide because of respiratory illness. I was there when he said goodbye to his best friends and mixed the lethal medication before he lay down and died. I have talked to a Greenlandic man who was stolen from his mother as a baby and taken to Denmark by a Danish childless nurse who thought she was doing good. When he finally met his biological mother 34 years later, they couldn't talk together because he had never learned to speak his native tongue. I've made a podcast about a woman subjected to attempted murder by her boyfriend. He stabbed her in the back with a knife. It got stuck in her spine, and she was transported into the hospital, lying on her side. She lost her ability to walk, but says that the experience transformed her, also in many good ways. I've interviewed a couple who had an abortion late in week 26 of the pregnancy and chose to spend days with their dead infant in a cradle lined with ice in a special wing of the hospital named Unit of Loss. And I've interviewed a man who killed his 2 young daughters, aged 9 and 10, because of a divorce gone wrong. He still thinks that it's his ex-wife's fault. If only she hadn't left me, I would never have done it, he told me. If there's one lesson I've learned throughout my career, it is this. Stories with a human touch stay with readers, users, and listeners and make them come back for more. And that is one of the things I will focus on in this talk. At the daily newspaper Politiken in Denmark, I hold the title Existential Editor. I generate and write stories about what it means to be merely and gloriously human. And when I recently spent a year as a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University, this gained a lot of attention among Americans. Such a thing would never be invented in the US, I was told. And I guess this is a very European way of looking at narrative journalism, as a way to try to answer the big questions in life. I will come back to that later. As you probably know, the term existentialism gained traction in the mid-20th century, here in Paris, especially around Jean-Paul Sartre and the Café du Flore. But one of the world's most famous philosophers and fathers of existentialism was actually Danish. His name was Søren Kierkegaard. As you say in France, you say Kierkegaard. And let me tell you something about him that not a lot of people know. Every day in the 1830s, Søren Kierkegaard would wander the streets of Copenhagen in Denmark, talking to ordinary people. His wise and groundbreaking thoughts about personal choice and faith were informed by these conversations, based on what he saw, what he felt and heard, while walking among ordinary people. He called this taken a daily human bath. At the existential desk at Politiken, I lead a group of 4 brilliant journalists and an intern. We write stories about love and life and death and everything in between. And we do it in a way that makes our subscribers feel something in their hearts and through their senses, and helps them understand themselves and the world in new ways. These stories are not just fascinating human case stories. They have to be linked to the news circle, or what we call the zeitgeist. So, when the science desk writes about the newest discoveries in DNA science, we write stories about dark family secrets being revealed through sites like MyHeritage. And when the international desk writes news about war in Europe, we write stories about how children of soldiers going to Afghanistan in the 2010s experienced losing their parents to war. And when the business section write about the food industry, we follow a pig all the way from piglet to pork roast. I'm going to show you a small film of the piglet I got to know, which landed on my plate. And we are asking whether knowing and bonding with an animal changes your relationship to your food. And when a famous author and celebrity dies at the age of 105 and her life is celebrated through obituaries and live television shows, we write a story about a day in the life of an ordinary woman of 104 years old, asking her to share her recipe for longevity. And in case you wonder, according to this woman, you get this old by practicing yoga every morning, having lots of friends, and always having a bottle of champagne ready for guests. And she even opens it with a saber. She's still alive, and she will be 107 next month. At the existential desk, we write about abstract phenomena, but our stories almost always have a strong human character in the center. We go into the world, we use all our senses, paying attention to details, so we can write stories rich in scene and dialogue using narrative journalism as our formula. We create podcasts, we produce ambitious digital content, and recently, Politiken has experimented with graphic novels on our site. And this is one of them, or part of it, from a story made by a young journalist about when his identity was stolen online and he got accused of a sexual assault. It is a result of collaboration across different sections of the newspaper, something which is extremely important for our work. We love teamwork. And I think that is also something which is very European. Instead of talking to people over the phone or researching in front of the camera, in front of a screen, we leave the newsroom and seek out the people and places we write about. With our notebook, a pen in hand, or a microphone, we take a human bath, just like the existentialist Søren Kierkegaard did 200 years ago. Now, this is not an easy task. It is sometimes psychologically demanding. It requires a lot of personal skill and journalistic tools. But it is, I should add, also very rewarding and meaningful. And it works. Back when I was a young journalist, passionate about this craft, these kind of stories were considered nice to have, not need to have. They were the soft spots between the hard news, like a sweet reward for eating your important news broccoli. But this is no longer the case. Thanks to metrics, we now know that our readers actually spent time on these kind of stories. We can tell that our stories hit a chord with our subscribers. Existential stories at Politiken are among the most popular. Our readers and listeners spend a lot of time on them. They typically read them all the way through to the end, which is not at all given these days. They are widely shared on social media, and, very importantly, they also generate subscriptions. They pay our salaries. To prove that this is not just some crazy claim of mine, I'll show you a recent analysis from my organization. Now, this very complicated chart is an analysis of 20,000 articles made by clever people from the analytics department. And first they found out what characterized an existential article. And this is it. There is a core, which is an existential article classic, which is a reference point. And then there is a periphery that are using some of the same existential elements or approaches. Both articles in the core and the periphery perform between 20 and 30% better than stories of equal length and genre. And also, when we look at this list of the 20 most read stories in 2024, again, out of thousands and thousands of articles published on Politiken's website, throughout the year, 1/3 were existential stories. And on the top of the chart, you'll find a story I did about people dying in a palliative care unit. I spent 2 weeks there around the clock with the photographer Jacob Erbahn, witnessing people saying goodbye to life and their loved ones, being taken care by dedicated nurses and doctors. This story, about 3 completely ordinary people approaching death, had an average reading time of more than 5 minutes, 7 times more than the average time spent on an article on our website, which is about 42 seconds. Now, we live in a time where the media landscape is in crisis. We're losing readers, and people in general are turning away from journalism. So why is it that these kind of articles draw so much attention? This has to do with the art of storytelling, and not least with the trace of a human voice. So let me explain what I mean by this. Last week, I spent 3 days with storytellers from all over the world, in Norway, in the small town of Bergen on the west coast. At the conference Fortellingskraft, called The Power of Storytelling in English, and journalists, authors, and editors from all over Europe came together to talk about journalism and not least storytelling. One of the things, obviously, very talked about was artificial intelligence and what AI means to our business and our profession. A lot of people at the conference expressed concern, worry, almost despair, when talking about how robots have quickly acquired writing skills similar to humans and much, much faster. We're becoming indispensable, some said. Soon we'll be out of work, others cried. But I chose to listen to this guy, one of the speakers, Mario Garcia, a newspaper and magazine consultant and a teacher at Columbia University in New York. He talked about the importance of journalists differentiating ourselves from the generic voice of the artificially produced journalism. He underlined how journalists have to leave our mark in the stories we do, a trace that shows the user that this story is not made by a robot. As he says, in a time of AI, we have to leave our human scent in the story, mark our territory just like a dog. Now, when I think about the journalism we do at the Existential desk at Politiken, and which I see other successful European storytellers do, it is exactly this. Even though artificial intelligence has a lot of power to search, retrieve, and put together knowledge and data, there are many things robots can't do, because they're not human. They don't have our ability to smell, to see, to touch, and to feel. Leaning into what makes us human is the only solution if we want to distinguish ourselves from AI. Because a robot can't hear the blackbird singing outside the window when a woman whispers goodbye to her dying uncle. And a robot can't sense the scent of a decaying corpse lying on a hill in North Carolina. A robot can't look into the eyes of a woman who has lost her 17-year-old daughter in a fire and hear her breathing as she gathers herself after crying. And a robot can't detect that the smell in an autopsy room is reminiscent of an open fridge, cold and sweet. So the human touch is our superpower, and storytelling is a way of reaching out, touching, and connecting with audiences, making them feel that what we care about their lives, and at the same time, helping them to understand, interpret, and mirror the world they live in. This way of using storytelling is not new. In fact, it's ancient, and we find it throughout all times and in all different cultures around the world. For instance, among the Acta people, a hunter-gatherer community thought to be one of the earliest inhabitants of the Philippines. Let me tell you a story from this specific tribe. Once upon a time, the sun and the moon, the man and the woman, had a quarrel. They quarreled over who was the strongest of the two and whether one or the other should carry out the important task of lighting up the sky. After a fierce fight, they discovered that actually they were equal in strength. Therefore, they decided to share the work. The sun would light up the sky during the day and the moon during the night. And thus, the celestial bodies were in harmony. Now, many of you will recognize the structure of this story from animal fables, books, and films. A simple story that conveys social norms and has a very clear moral. This story is one of four which a group of anthropologists from University College of London were told during a field study among the Acta people. But they didn't go there to research storytelling. They went there to investigate the value the Acta people gave to various members of their tribal communities, how they valued the best hunters, the best gatherers, the strongest fishermen, and then to have a test group, they also asked the tribe members to evaluate the tribe's storytellers, which was a less significant group, or so they thought. Nearly 300 Acta people from 18 separate villages were asked to value different members, and they gave them tokens of rice. And the research was published in a study in 2018, and much to the anthropologists' surprise, the storytellers were valued higher than all other professions, even above the best hunters. The anthropologists found that the storytellers were more popular with the opposite sex, and they also had more kids than average, 0.5 times more children, in fact. Now, why is this? Their explanation was that the storytellers contributed to an understanding of the group's social interactions and reinforced the norms and ethics of the tribe. They conveyed a message and rules of cooperation, social equality, and gender roles. The story about the sun and the moon, for instance, promotes cooperation between the sexes. And the researchers found that overall levels of cooperation were higher in camps with greater proportions of skilled storytellers. The better the stories were told, the better the tribe worked. I stumbled upon this study in 2018 when I was researching my textbook about narrative journalism, and I was thrilled, both as a researcher and a storyteller. I mean, who doesn't want more rice and more attention from the opposite sex? So I used this story in my book, Politiken, which is a Danish textbook on how to do narrative journalism. Telling stories is a part of human DNA, and it has been like that since the beginning of time, not just as entertainment during long winter nights or around the campfire, but to help us understand ourselves and communicate important lessons, rules, and norms in society. The stories we tell each other shape the communities we live in, and this also applies to journalistic storytelling. And therefore, the way these stories are told mirrors the structure of the fabric of our societies, whether the stories are told in the Philippines, in the US, or here in Europe. When it comes to storytelling, for many years, Europe has looked to America for inspiration, not only in film, music, books, and television, but also when it comes to journalism. The American way of storytelling is a formula we have been spoon-fed from an early age, the formula we, for instance, find in Hollywood. Although Americans have made narrative techniques in film and journalism famous, the roots of storytelling are clearly European. Actually, the great-grandfathers of storytelling were Greek, and these two white-bearded men might not seem very vogue today, but 2,500 years ago, they were among the most valued members of the European intelligentsia. 425 years before Christ, Herodotus wrote the histories. He didn't just record events, he gathered voices, myths, memories, weaving fact and fable into the first great narrative of human experience. And then, a century later, Aristotle wrote Poetics and showed us why stories have such a great impact on us. He broke good storytelling down into a beginning, a middle, and an end, characters who struggle, conflict that transforms, and katasis that releases. So, Herodotus told the stories, and a century later, Aristotle explained why they work so well. In my view, this combination of historical, philosophical, and human insight paved the way for what I would call a European art of storytelling. But if storytelling is, by design, a European invention, how come we never talk about it as such, but instead look to the US whenever we have to learn or practice the craft? And why are most textbooks about narrative journalism written by Americans with American examples? I've been wondering about this, not least last year, when I was studying at Harvard as a Nieman Fellow. The textbook I wrote on narrative journalism in 2019, Fortælling og Tid, is written in Danish and therefore not accessible to students and journalists outside of Scandinavia. So this summer I decided to go looking for the DNA of European storytelling to piece together a book on this topic for European journalists and students. The reason for my project is not only educational. I have a feeling that Europeans today long for something that unites us. Not a political, monetary, or military conflict, but something bigger. And this also goes for journalists. So I've set out to capture what distinguishes the art of storytelling, of European storytelling. What do we have in common, if anything, and what are our differences? One of the first steps on this project involved interviewing some of the practitioners of the craft around Europe. And one of the people I reached out to is this Finnish journalist, Anu Nousiainen. More than a decade ago, in 2012, she studied this exact topic while spending a semester at Oxford University in Great Britain. Her research looked at the differences between American and European traditions when it came to narrative journalism, and her conclusion was this. Narrative journalism is clearly an American journalistic form that has not gained popularity in Europe. She pointed to training as one of the largest obstacles and to the lack of recognition. We are still a long way from granting serious recognition to the literary qualities of the best journalism, she said. Today, more than a decade later, she's rewriting her conclusions. Things have definitely changed in Europe the last 10 plus years after the Oxford paper, she says. Feature journalism is more recognized, more practiced, and even teaching is at a higher level. This is also evident in the committee of the European Press Prize. The prize has existed for more than 10 years, honoring the best journalism in Europe. And it has awards in 5 categories: the Investigative Reporting Award, the Public Discourse Award, the Innovation Award, the Migration Award, and the Distinguished Writing Award, which is for narrative journalism. The director of the European Press Prize told me that European Press Prize every year receives more than 800 entries, last year from 44 countries. And the Distinguished Writing Award category is by far the most popular of them all. In the last couple of years, 1/3 of the entries have been in this category. Now, I'm only in the beginning of this journey across the landscape of narrative Europe, but I think it's safe to say that narrative storytelling is thriving in Europe. Of course, there are also differences. We don't share the same language, even though translations with AI these years are making journalism available that we weren't able to read just a couple of years ago. So I can now study and get inspired by the work of colleagues from Finland and Turkey, something I couldn't do only a couple of years ago. There are also large inequalities when it comes to resources. Northern and Western Europe invest more in this genre than East and South and receive more training. But European storytellers also have a lot in common when it comes to style and content. Compared to the US, European storytellers have a less flowery, less dramatic way of telling stories, less Hollywood, and more existential. European storytelling very often revolves around solidarity and insolidarity. It often celebrates the losers or small person fighting a bigger system, rather than an American archetype story where a superhero saves the world, or the traditional Hollywood script about going from rags to riches. At the core of many European narratives, there is an underlying ideal that a good, sound, and healthy democracy relies on equality and collaboration, rather than survival of the fittest. In many European countries, strong national media corporations ensure that no matter where you come from, who you are, and what kind of money you make, you have access to free media outlets of a relatively high quality. And, very importantly, narrative journalism is present in countries all over Europe. There is what I would call a European storytelling tribe, who share this passion for telling true stories through a narrative to a growing audience. The last decade, narrative conferences have sprung up all over Europe, for example in Norway, in Romania, and in the Netherlands. And I'm eager to bring these people together and their writing together in a book project. As a true storyteller, I will now use one of the oldest tricks in the book and place a cliffhanger there. I really hope to present my further findings in due time. Now, I hope that you, through this talk, has gotten a sense that I have a very strong love for journalism. I believe in telling the truth, holding power accountable, and I believe that in doing so, we support a healthy democracy. It is a great responsibility. However, I also see numerous warning signs. Still fewer people subscribe to or follow a traditional media. The notion of fake news is becoming a dominant narrative, not only in the US, but also in other parts of the world, including here in Europe. And more people are turning away from the news because they feel fatigued or depressed, reading about conflict, political division, and climate threats. If we want to gain popularity with our audience, reclaim our popularity, just like the storytellers of the actor people, we need to tell them stories that are important to them, that provide a deeper understanding of the world they live in. We need to connect with them as humans. Journalism has to be important, valuable, and engaging so that our users feel like rewarding us with their trust and their time. And the European art of narrative, journalism with an existential touch, might be one of the ways to attract an audience. So, my advice to you is this: go out, face the world, bear witness, and report with all your senses, with your mind, with your heart, and with your humanness. It is a huge obligation, but trust me when I tell you that it matters. This is what the times are calling for, this is what the users are craving, and that gives me hope. One of the most important skills of a journalist is asking questions, so you might as well start now.
Hello, thank you for this very interesting lecture. I had a question about the stories you've told us about that are quite impressive, and I wanted to know how you are able to gain the trust of the people you tell the story. And yeah, how do you take time with them and how do you meet them? I think of the first people you talked about.
It is a good question, and thank you for that. So meeting people is always a huge responsibility. So to build trust, one of the things that I think is very important is to have time. So time is very crucial when you do storytelling like this, if you do immersive journalism. But it's also very important to explain people what you actually do. Being very transparent about what you want to do, how you want to do it, how long it's going to take, where it's going to be published, what kind of rights they have. So one of the things I spend a lot of time on, especially with vulnerable sources, with immersive journalism, is explaining what's going on. Because a lot of ordinary people have absolutely no clue about what journalism is about. And I think a lot of journalists think, oh, yeah, they know what this is about, but they don't. So being very transparent, having lots of time, and of course high ethics, high morals, high empathy is also very important. But yeah, time and transparency, that's your two friends.
As an editor now, do you still have time to do this?
Yeah, I would say that. So some of the stories I do are done on deadline and done like day to day. And when you don't have that much time, it's, you have to use the same tools in the box as when you do like immersive journalism for months. So you have like the screwdriver and the hammer, and sometimes you can only use one of them because you only have one day. But I mean, it's still possible. It has to do with explaining what you do and then using all your senses. That's very, very important, I would say. Using all your senses and putting the reader there. That's possible even if you have just a short period of time. I do lots of deadline stories. Sometimes I spend years with people, and sometimes I have to do things in one day. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, thank you for the lecture. It's a bit in the same sense as Lauren said. Like when you have the confidence of the people, how do you get to thank them after they gave you all the stories? Because I know that sometimes we can have information and then I feel like I'm gonna take advantage
Yeah,
on.
you feel like a vulture, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and
yeah,
how can you deal with
Yeah.
this kind of things?
So one of the things I think is very important to understand when you are a journalist is that it is a profession where we cross boundaries. It is a profession where we invade people's private life. We ask them questions they don't want to answer about stuff they might even haven't told anybody else. And so it is definitely an invasive profession, but that doesn't mean you don't have to treat these people well. So I think one of the ways that I come to terms with this kind of work is saying to myself, this is my work, I am a professional, but I'm also a person. So you have to use also your humanness when you deal with these people. And I very often check up on people, like after I've taken, if it's a tough interview, I would send them a text when I'm leaving saying, thank you so much for spending time with me. And the day after, I will check in on them. I will always be very frank about, so this is when you hear from me. I will send the article for you to read, or it will be published here and there. So it's very much in being transparent and not kind of trying to sneak things in or push it under the table. I mean, if you want to write about something that personal or private, you have to be very, very clear and very frank about it. Yeah. But of course, I mean, we write about when things go wrong. We don't write about, oh my God, the metro was on time today. That's not the kind of journalism we do, right? The journalism is writing about things that are wrong or things that are difficult. Sometimes we also write about love and beautiful things, but very often we will write about things that have gone wrong. And that is part of our profession. So one has to come to terms with that and not feel like a vulture, because I think for many of these people, telling their story is also very empowering. That's at least how I experience with so many people, that they feel empowered, being able to give a voice to their own story.
Hello, this mic is a little bit high. Okay. Thank you for the lecture. I kind of have a two-part question. I think in Europe there are like a lot of countries, a lot of them are different as well. I don't know how advanced you are in your research, but have you seen recently or like up to now maybe countries that do immersive journalism or narrative journalism differently, or what are some examples of in different countries, different medias, or maybe different programs that have inspired you that maybe might be a little bit different from what you do at your position,
Yeah.
but that are quite similar? Because I've never heard of an existential desk somewhere else.
No, no,
So
it's up
I'm
for
intrigued.
grabs. You can go out and create your own existential title and just spread it all over the world. No, so this is unique, this title, but I think this approach is not unique. But I do think that the way we have coined it, the way I work and what I've been talking about today, actually has a flavor of what it means to be European. It is a more kind of thoughtful, is a more deep approach to storytelling, a less dramatic, more toned down, maybe a little bit more intellectual, more, I would say, less flowery and more existential, more dressed down kind of style. And also, as I mentioned, with topics that actually revolve around different things that you see, for instance, in the US, which has for many years been the way, the people showing the way. But yes, what I would say is that, of course, there are very different traditions from country to countries. This is also taught differently from country to country. For instance, it is not as highly valued in Great Britain as it is in Scandinavia, for instance. And I think the resources in, for instance, Moldova are not as huge as they are in Germany. So of course there are huge differences, but what I sense from talking to colleagues from all over Europe is that there is this same urge to write these stories and to push this kind of art of storytelling forward into the world with a European touch. And I also do feel that a lot of conferences are springing up, and when I meet the other storytellers from Europe, they share the same, I would say, the same longing to unite on a different kind of way of doing things than how it's done in the US. So yeah, there is definitely, of course there are differences. There are also, as I mentioned, budget differences and also teaching differences on how you teach narrative. But I think, you know, a book on how to do narrative in English with examples from Europe, that's what I want to do, and I think that will definitely be useful for many also educators all over Europe. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's okay.
Hi, thank you for the lecture. I have a question about ethics.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned in the beginning an article that you wrote about someone dying and you being there with their friends.
Yes.
Can you tell us more about the context?
Yes.
How did it happen, and how far can journalists get involved in people's lives in such circumstances?
Yeah, this is a very good example. I mean, I'm very, I'm obsessed with ethics. I think it's really interesting, you know, what is right, what is wrong, how do we approach human beings, how do we take part in their life, how do we do that without influencing their decisions. So this story came about because we discuss in Denmark now whether we should have assisted aid in dying, medical aid in dying, as is the case in both the many states in the US and in many countries in Europe. And this was a huge political topic last year, and it's still being debated whether we should have this law. And so what I thought could be interesting was actually following someone who, because we do not have this law, what did they do? So they take their life all alone, right? That is the only option you have. And so suicide is a very lonely thing, right? And so for almost 2 years, I was looking for someone who would share their suicide with me. And the thing is, if you are, by Danish law, if you are present at a suicide, you can actually get convicted for not calling help. So this is, by design, illegal, right? But I'm a journalist, and I wanted to be there because I wanted to bear witness to this, which is a very lonely situation, right? So I found this guy who was very vocal about his suicide. He had told his friends, he had told, like, he even said it to his own doctor, right? So a lot of people around him knew, because he was so ill, that he really wanted to die, and he didn't want to die of not being able to breathe anymore. So I followed him for a couple of months, but before I started doing that, I had a meeting with my editor-in-chief and with the legal department, and they said, the legal department said, go ahead, you know, this is not a legal thing, this is ethics. And the editor-in-chief said, you can't be in the room when he dies. You can't, you know, that's impossible, because that's too challenging for your ethics. And I was like, no, I mean, I want to be there. So forth and back about that for quite a while. And in the end, he decided, you can be there when he mixes the medication, but you cannot be in the room when he takes his own life. So I was very upset about that, I have to be honest. But I was there when he mixed the medication. And then, as he was just about to drink it, I went outside with the photographer, and I stayed in the photographer's car for 11 hours, waiting for this guy to die. His best friend was there, and she could have been accused. I mean, she was there, of course, as a secret, but she was there. And in the end, she phoned us up just as he had drawn his last breath and said, he's died now. And then we ran in, and we were there like 2 minutes after he died. So I wasn't present when he died, but I was very close, I would say. But to me, it's a very important story. It's, you know, if we can't bear witness, if we can't tell these stories, who can? I think it's a very important story to tell.
Thank you.
Thank you for your conference. I'm not a student of journalism, so I don't know if I might say something that will offend
Go ahead,
journalists.
you can't go wrong.
Thank you. So I think the current geopolitical, societal situation that we live in gives us all, if not the people who are close to me some kind of existential reality, and that would lean towards the pessimistic kind of side of things. Do you think that it is important to continue, like to reinforce this existentialism? Or do you think journalism has also another storytelling responsibility to make us see the world in a better way?
I think we have an obligation to show the world as the world is. I mean, it's not for us as journalists to decide whether should we show like a good or a worse kind of version of the world. We are like the prisms of the reality around us. What I think is very important is that we also reflect many different like perspectives and many different environments and many different like human beings. So I think our obligation is to go out into the world and try to reflect that unbiased and go into as many different situations, sceneries, human beings as possible. And I think sometimes what I see is more a lot of journalists analyzing what's going on in the world, staying inside their news desk at a distance, looking at the world, thinking about what the world is like or what they would like it to be or what they think underlying the world this is supposed to mean. And I think that kind of journalism is also important. But to me, it's very important that we as journalists go out into the world and actually show what's going on. And one example is the way the coverage, the European coverage of the US, which is very analytical, very political, and I feel I don't get to know very much about the Americans. So I think it's a very big obligation also as journalists in Europe to go out and cover the ground, meet people, walk the floor. That's a very important part of journalism.
A bit high. Hello, thank you for lecture. Sorry, I have two questions. The first one, probably more related to like the constraints journalists are under. You're saying, and I very much agree with you, that we need to go out and take the time to meet people. But we are at the time when newsroom ask more and more like fewer journalists to do the same job, if not more.
Yeah,
And
same in Denmark.
And where you're in the newsroom, you feel like you don't actually have the time to go out and meet people and have this human bath that you were talking about. So my question would be, how do we either still do it under these constraints, or how do we push newsroom into letting journalists have like the time to do such thing? And my second question would be, when you're telling like very personal stories, you said that people might feel empowered by telling those, but sometimes I have a feeling that they might feel dispossessed of the stories, because we're journalists, so even though we are telling all the facts and what we see, I think sometimes we have maybe like the same position as like a shrink, like
yes,
you have this not objective, but like different gaze on the person's stories, and you might be able to see things that the people is maybe aware of, but like not willing to tell, but you still perceive it, and sometimes it's important for the story to include it, and at this time they might feel dispossessed. So how do you deal with it?
With that, okay. So the first question was, sorry, it's just two questions in one. So one is about the industry and how little time we have and how we can make editors understand we have to do this kind of journalism. So we live in a time of like crisis in this industry, but just tell you the truth, when I became a journalist 25 years ago, people were also talking about the crisis of journalism. And I was also told that we didn't have the time to go out and meet these people. And so I really feel that the metrics have helped me to kind of push this agenda. And I think that's also the reason why we see this storytelling thriving all over Europe, because we have quite sophisticated metrics showing us that people actually want this kind of work. So I think it's very much like getting to do this kind of work is by example. It's by doing these stories and see them are taking on, that people really do read them, that they share them, that at least that's what's helped me. I mean, I used to be niche. I didn't used to be, asked to come and talk about narrative storytelling. I used to just, do my thing, and then gradually I can tell that this is what people actually spent their time on, and they actually read it right to the end, and they actually buy subscriptions. So I think it is very much by example that you show your editors that this is worth doing. What do you do when you don't have much time? I don't usually have that much time. I mean, sometimes I will spend a lot of time with people, like the person who was taking his own life, but I was doing like 7 other stories at the same time. So it's all about juggling. Sometimes you do immersive, this part of your work, and then you do fast news in this part of your work. So it's always like, for me, it's juggling as well, right? So that is how it is to be a journalist in many ways. I do think, however, that sometimes when I do things on deadline, like the old woman, the 104-year-old, yeah. So I talked to her for 22 minutes on the phone before I did this story, and it was read by 250,000 people. And in Denmark, we're only 6 million, by the way, right? So this is a huge traction. It was a story, I talked to her for 22 minutes, I wrote the story in 2 hours, and it was out right away. So this is a story made on deadline. And I did the interview in the newsroom, and this woman was slightly deaf. So I think like everybody in the newsroom heard this interview because like, so tell me what you do in the morning, But so it's all about having the narrative tools on how you get a person to talk about scenery and details, and then knowing how to write it in a very captivating way. And that is, of course, experience, but it also has to do with teaching and learning, right? So I think these stories can also be done on deadline. It doesn't always have to be like immersive, huge digital production, I do both. And I think everybody and the journalists in the futures have to do both, because we can't afford the luxury of doing this for months and months and months. Sometimes we can and sometimes we can't. So the other thing you were talking about is people feeling disposed. And I would say that if you meet people with a very honest will to get to know them, and you talk to them about what you want to write about, and you kind of include them in this process, and you're very transparent about it, and you don't try to hide it away, like, okay, I have this agenda, but I better not tell her that this is actually a story about something else. Don't do that. I mean, you have to be very honest with the people you meet. Look them in the eye and say, okay, I'm doing this story. It's a story about how suicide can be contagious through generations. It is a story about that scientists have found out that children of people who commit suicide has a 3 times high rate of committing suicide themselves, right? So I have this piece of science, and I want to talk to you about your mother's suicide. I'm not going to, hide away that this is my agenda. It's very important to tell them. So I want you to tell me everything about this. And I also want to ask you, are you worried about whether this could happen to you or to your brother or to your sister? So I think, being transparent and honest about what you do, even though it's sometimes really hard, is a way to win people over. And you mentioned the psychologist. I typically say journalists are a profession in between between psychology and anthropology. So you have psychologists and anthropologists, and then you have journalists. And we kind of unite those 2 professions. But we break the code of silence of the psychologist, that's for sure, right? So that's why you need to be very transparent with your sources.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was wondering how you defend the importance of this kind of narrative journalism or existential journalism, because I think a lot of newsrooms are leaning more into faster, more, I don't know, just faster journalism, also for budgetary reasons. As you said, a lot of people don't subscribe to newsrooms or to newspapers. So I was wondering, how did you convince yours to adopt this kind of journalism, or how would you convince some other editorial project that this kind of journalism is needed?
So again, I know it's boring answering a little bit the same, but the metrics is your friend. So what has happened to me was like, I've insisted on doing this kind of work, and I used to do it at smaller newspapers, and it got a lot of traction. So I was winning prizes, I was nominated for prizes, people could tell it was sparking a fire. And then in my current job, we kind of decided to do more of this kind of journalism because they could tell that this is the kind of journalism of the future. We can tell that people really want this. But the thing is, I showed you some metrics from the analytical department. And these are kind of new metrics. I mean, we have been told, we can tell, yeah, this story went really well, 250,000 people read about the old lady. Wow, ooh, that's a surprise. But then suddenly when they start doing the analytics, they can tell that this kind of journalism is very valuable. Of course, you can't just step into a newsroom as a 25-year-old reporter and say, let's form an existential desk with 5 people only prioritizing this kind of stuff. It takes time, of course, for sure. But it's important to do this kind of work on side of the other work and then see what works. And I think it is my experience that it really does work with the users and the listeners. In Denmark, we've had a lot of other newspapers trying to copy this now, which is really interesting. So we have like one of our biggest competitors suddenly started writing about a lot of these topics because they could tell that when they started doing a series about children talking about losing a parent or whatever, it was like a huge, success. So yeah, it is showing by example, for sure. That's my best advice.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for being with us. I have a question about to follow up with the comic format that you, I guess that people reading newspapers and especially Politiken in Denmark are quite well educated. How do you do to reach out to the part of the Danish population which doesn't read the newspapers?
Yeah. Oh, this is a great example, and it doesn't even have to be like education or not. It's just there's a huge age gap, right? I have my children are 18, 21, and 24, and they don't pick up a newspaper and kind of flick through the pages of the newspaper. That's not their style, right? They get their news on Instagram or TikTok or whatever. So, you have to cater to different audiences on different formats. And many of these stories they're made as Instagram stories. We do different like short news podcasts also teasing for these stories. We do video, we do all kinds of things to attract people. And what we do is like, if we have a great story, we will try to slice it up and do a written story, which is digital. We will do it in print. We will also do a docs, like a podcast version. We will invite the journalist into the news podcast studio in the morning and talk about this story. We will do an Instagram story with some of the great video and photo footage. So we're really trying to cater to many, many different audiences. But yes, of course, one of the limits is that you have to pay for a subscription these days, right? And that's why I think it's very important to have like national media, which is free for the public, which is one of the biggest strengths in Europe, is that we actually do have these. We do in Denmark, we have DR, you also here in France, you have national channels that produce really great journalism. But for my newspaper, the most important part is getting people to subscribe to a newspaper, and it's actually not that expensive, not even for younger people. Yeah. Did that answer your question? It is. Yeah.
Hello, my question is, what do you think is the connection between existential journalism and local journalism?
I think when you look at existential journalism, it just aligns so well with local journalism. So I teach journalists, even grown-up journalists in Denmark, and many of the journalists I teach actually work at local newspapers. And I teach them to do narrative because it is a very important part of being a local journalist, that you actually write about the things going on in the community. You write about the human stories, about the local politicians, the kindergarten, the schools, all these things, and applying the existential touch to this kind of journalism is so important, because you have to write about what people care about and what's close to their life. So I think, yeah, existential journalism or narrative journalism in its purest form is very important when you do local journalism. And I also do feel the young woman who was asking about how do you find time, and people, less and less time. Local journalists are among the most time pressured of all. I mean, when I meet local journalists and they have to write a lot, fast, small things, blah, 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 they are under a lot of time pressure, but they still manage to carve out some of these amazing human stories. But they need the tools, and they also need to believe in the possibility of making these stories and that it's actually valuable. So it also has to do with believing in it and having the confidence to do these stories. And then what they see is, whoa, my audience just loves these kind of stories. And then they start doing them more. So it also has to do with confidence very often.